Okay, so let's get started. Have you ever heard about Mount Rushmore in the United States of America? Yes, Mount Rushmore. Mount Rushmore is actually a tourist attraction in the US, and it is famous for the fact that it has the faces, the sculpting of the faces of four beloved American presidents, namely Thomas Jefferson, Theodore Roosevelt, Abraham Lincoln, and George Washington. Now, all of these faces appear on Mount Rushmore, and it attracts about 2 million tourists every year. Now you may begin to wonder, is this a history class? No, this is a class for literature. And then you may also begin to wonder, what has the faces of American presidents got to do with poetry, got to do with literature and the likes? But there's only one way to find out. I'd like you to just sit back, and I'll be right back in a minute. So, you are welcome once again. My name is Olabode Ajayi, and this is High School Literature. In this video, we'll look at poetry, the definitions of poetry, different explanations, descriptions, and definitions of poetry. We'll also look at some of the accessories, some of the things that make poetry stand out, some of the things that make poetry unique in its own right as a distinct genre of literature. Then we'll also go on to look at some of the different types of poems that we have. We have epic, elegiac, ballad, sonnet, and the likes. All of these and more we'll try to look at in this video. So what is poetry? Now, poetry is language at its finest. Poetry is language at its peak. Poetry is language at its pinnacle. Poetry is language at its best. Initially, I talked about the sculpting of the faces of four American presidents on Mount Rushmore. Now, the reason I had to bring that description into this discourse is to help you to understand that language may be viewed as a mountain, and it takes certain persons with certain skills to bring out the beauty from this mountain. The sculptor that sculpted the faces of these four American presidents on Mount Rushmore was able to bring out his craft because he had the right implements, he had the right instrument, he had the right equipment to work with. And looking at this mountain, he began to picture the faces of these presidents at different locations. And then over a period of time, he was able to bring out these faces to the delight of several persons around. He was only able to do that because he was a master of his craft. This also applies to poets as well. Poets are masters at their craft. Poets are people who are able to speak in an elevated form of language. They are able to express themselves in an elevated form of language. Yes, they have language, they have words at their disposal. But for every poet that puts pen to paper, they are able to do this not just because they intend to put pen to paper, but because they intend to also express their emotions, their feelings, their perception about the world around them, and a couple of other things here and there. When poets put pen to paper, they do so because they are deliberate about the words they put on paper. They are intentional about these words. So words are not allowed to go to waste. Every word that proceeds from a poet proceeds for a purpose. It behoves on you and I to pick up these pieces of artistry, these poems, and interrogate them, ask questions, and get at the root of the matter. Because whenever poets write, 1 word, 2 words, 3 words might be all they require to express themselves. And these words cannot always be understood from the general perspective or point of view alone. You need to dig deep to get at the crux of the matter. So, whenever poets write, they write in a very, very deliberate manner. Because even though they have, the word is their space, they can, choose to manipulate words and all of that. They are very, very economical with words. Poets are very, very choosy with words. They don't use words anyhow because they don't have the luxury of having to explain everything. No, with poetry, the poet is deliberate about the words. He can't keep describing and explaining and expatiating and all of that. No, he says one word, and that word will produce not just a single but multiple layers of meaning. With poetry, words are strung together to create images. Words are strung together to produce ideas. Words are strung together to produce sounds, to produce constructs, abstract constructs, as the case may be. So according to the site Thoughtful tries in describing poetry, and I love their definition of poetry. For them, they said Poetry is the chiseled marble of language. The chiseled marble of language. In other words, anyone who wants to engage in poetry must be ready to work with the right implement, the right instrument, the right equipment to bring out the very best out of language, to give us language in its finest forms. I get it when you talk about the fact that noble characters in ancient Greek writings actually speak in poetic languages. They have this poetic elevated form of speaking. So poetry also can be described as an elevated form of speaking. Not everybody can speak in a poetic manner. Many of us speak in prosaic forms, once in a while moving in and out of the poetic. But many people generally speak in prosaic form. They have to describe and describe and describe and describe. With poetry, you do not have the luxury of time, the luxury of space to begin to describe and explain. You just go ahead and drop it as the case may be. One other definition of poetry that I love so much is that it was given by William Wordsworth. William Wordsworth was a Romanticist poet, and he describes poetry as the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings and emotions collected in tranquility. In other words, for him, poetry is the overflow. When you don't just have the filling up of a container, you have the overflow. So with poetry, it is an overflow of your emotions, your deepest feelings that you are able to recollect and remember in your moments of tranquility and ease. That is poetry. In a nutshell, poetry may be described as the ability to express words in an elevated form. Now, am I simply saying that you don't have poems that describe and explain? No. As a matter of fact, research has shown to us that poems of the modern and postmodern era are poems that go ahead to describe and explain and all of that. That form of elevation in language is not really always present in poems of these days. When you look at poems of yesteryears, poems of 400-500 years ago, poems about 1,000 years ago, 2,000 years ago, you find out that whenever poems are expressed, spoken or written out, they are done with such artistry. Poetry these days is, almost everybody is a poet nowadays. You just sit down, put pen to paper, and they just recite the poem. Oh, I was walking down the sea, I saw this, I saw that, and that's what we have in many poems of these days. But that doesn't take away the fact that some of these poems still make sense, and they're able to have some meanings that come out to you and I as students of literature. Now let's look at some of the accessories of poetry. The accessories of poetry, some of the features, some of the characteristics, some of the defining things that make poetry stand out. Of course, we've talked about stanza in an earlier video, one of my first videos, my inaugural video. I looked at stanza as one of the things that you find in poetry. So poems come out to us in stanzas. Okay, you could have a poem that has just one stanza. You could have a poem that has 2, 3, 4, 5, 7 stanzas, as the case may be. All of this is at the discretion of the poet. Okay, stanzas are to poetry just as paragraphs are to prose of works of fiction. So just as you have paragraphs in works of fiction and prose, narrative and the likes, you also have stanzas in poetry. They are the units that you find that poems are actually divided in. So you have poems come to us in stanzas. Another thing that makes poetry stand out is the presence of rhymes and rhythm. Many poems actually have rhymes and rhythm. Some don't have, some have rhymes. When words rhyme, we simply say words sound in the same form. Words sound alike. Of course, we talked about the fact that in poetry, words are strung together to produce sounds. So don't forget that. They don't just produce images and imagery, they also produce sounds as well. So when words sound alike, we will talk about rhyme in that instance. And what is poetry without rhyme? Rhyme actually helps the poems to stay longer with us. When poems rhyme, they get to have this musicality that goes along with it. The same also applies to rhythm. You will not really enjoy rhythm until you have poems recited out aloud. When you decide to read a poem and internalize them, you may not really get the beauty of rhyme and rhythm. But when you read it out to yourself, you find this particular flow, this particular beat that accompanies these poems. And these beats are defined by the variables, the variations in stressed and unstressed coming at even or uneven intervals, as the case may be. That's number 2. Number 3, poems are also loaded with images. So you have the issue of imagery in poems. Poems try to give us mental picture with the use of symbols and images to create an ideal picture at the back of our mind. So whenever you pick a work of poetry, you find out that the poet tries with the use of certain words to create certain mental pictures for us to follow. When we are able to follow this picture, they create these images at the back of our mind. You find this also very, very peculiar in poetry. One other thing about poetry is the fact that poets, well, they have a lot of words at their disposal, but there is an economy of words in poetry. Like I said earlier on, ancient poems up to the modern period were poems that were not given over to explaining and expatiating and all of that. These were poems that tried as much as possible to say so much with the smallest amount of words. In other words, poems can be described as being cryptic in nature. They are loaded with meanings. Your ability to unravel different layers is contingent on your level of exposure and your level of knowledge. If you are limited in knowledge, then you may not be able to go far in unraveling different layers that the literary artist or the poet wants to get at. So these are some of the features that you find in poetry. There are quite a number. Some others, I talked about the fact that in poems you don't have a strict adherence to the rules of grammar. Whenever it comes to grammar related issues, you don't find them strictly enforced in poetry. That's why we talk about poetic license. So the poet is allowed to, break with the rules of grammar, as the case may be, simply because he might be registering his pleasure, or it might just be the safest and the best way for him to convey the deepness of his intention. Another thing about poetry that you also find is the use of certain devices. They are known as poetic devices. Poetic devices also feature heavily in works of poetry. Metaphor, simile, oxymoron, paradox, sarcasm, irony. All of these devices are also very much prevalent in works of poetry. So these are some of the things that you find that make poetry stand out. There are quite a number of them, but these are the ones that I can afford to give to you in this video. The video cannot do justice to all these things, as the case may be. In case you've come across some other features that make poetry also stand out and unique in its own form, you can please leave them in the comment section below. Let's have a fruitful interaction, okay? And I promise to get back to you on those ones. Okay, so let's look at some of the types of poems that you have. We have different types of poems, okay? And because of time, I like to just run through all of them in one clean swoop. Please follow me and stay tuned, okay? Number 1, let's look at the epic. An epic is a very long poem. Number 2, an epic is also a poem that is known to tell a story. It is narrative in nature. Number 3, an epic is a poem that is also mythical. It talks about myth, stories that are mythical in nature. Number 4, it's a poem that talks about a particular hero with special abilities or superhuman abilities. When you have all of these things present in a single poem, then you are simply talking about an epic. Please don't forget, an epic is long, it is narrative in nature, it talks about stories, myths, okay, and then it talks about a human being that has special abilities. It talks about his vicissitude in life, his confrontations with the elements, the elemental forces, human beings, gods and goddesses, the world of the physical, the world of the metaphysical, and so on and so forth. So sometimes he comes out alive, he comes out with his life intact. Sometimes he evolves as a tragic hero. One very good example of an epic is an epic by Homer. Homer is credited with writing 2 very beautiful epics. The first is titled The Iliad, and the second is titled The Odyssey. If you remember the story of Achilles heals and all of that, yes, that story is actually it's an epic. It's taken from Homer's Iliad. Then if you have also watched the film The Odyssey, or the story of Odysseus, okay, that story is also taken from Homer's The Odyssey. Then you also have Sundiata. Sundiata is an epic from Mali. It's a very, very interesting story as well from Mali. And then of course you have the Anglo-Saxon epic by the title Beowulf. Beowulf is also a fantastic piece. You may want to watch the film adaptation of Beowulf. The latest one, I think, is 2007, acted by Angelina Jolie. It's very, very interesting. Number 2, let's look at the ballad. The ballad is also a narrative poem, and it's very similar to the epic. But the difference between the epic and the ballad is the fact that a ballad is shorter in length than an epic. An epic is way, way long. So if you look at the epic as a marathon runner, as a 10,000 marathon runner, you look at the ballad as like a 400-meter runner. Okay, ballad is like a 400-meter runner. The epic is like a 10,000 marathon runner. Both of them also tell stories, but the epic tells a story about a strong human personage. The ballad does not. It just tells a story, and that's that about that. Okay. Now let's talk about the ode. What the ode does as a work of poetry is the celebration or the praise or the honor given to a particular person, a particular individual, describing a particular event, the praise of an event, the praise of an object, a phenomenon, a thing, as the case may be. So whenever you come across a poem that celebrates any of the aforementioned things I've talked about, that poem most likely is an ode. Examples of ode, John Keats wrote several odes. I remember reading Ode on a Christian Horn several years ago as a student, back in secondary school. Ode on a Christian Horn, and then you have Ode to the Nightingale, you have Ode on Melancholy, and so on and so forth. The haiku is a very unique poem because it has several features that makes it unique. Number 1, it is one stanza. Number 2, it is of Japanese origin. Number 3, it comes to us in 3 lines. Number 4, it has 17 syllables. These 4 features describe what the haiku is all about. When you see a poem that has just one stanza, 3 lines, okay, and 17 syllables, the first line has 5 syllables, the second line has 7 syllables, the third line also has 5 syllables, that comes to a total of 17. Once a poem has all these features, irrespective of whatsoever it discusses, that poem is a haiku. Now, closely related to the haiku in terms of length is the limerick. So what is a limerick? The limerick is also a one stanza poem that comes to us in 5 lines. The limerick comes to us in 5 lines. It's a poem that has one stanza, 5 lines, and it has a rhyme scheme of A, A, B, B, A. So the first and second and fifth lines rhyme together, and then the third and the fourth lines also rhyme. When you see a poem, irrespective of the content that it discusses, irrespective of the emotion that is expressed in it, if a poem comes to you in 5 lines and it has a rhyme scheme of A, A, B, B, A, that poem most likely is a limerick. Don't forget, it also comes to us in 1 stanza. What is an elegy? The elegy may be described as a poem that discusses sorrow, pain, death, loss, or is a poem that talks about mourning. When there's a poem that discusses mourning, someone is reflecting about a bad, a terrible situation, the loss of another fellow, the loss of an opportunity, just reflective about some of these things, then most likely that poem is an elegy. A very good one would be elegy written in a country churchyard. The sonnet is a poem of 14 lines. Any poem that comes out as 14 lines, that poem most likely is a sonnet. Now there are 2 types of sonnets. By virtue for your level, there are several, there are about 3 or 4 types. But for your level of speaking, can be contained with just these 2 types. The first is the Italian sonnet, and the second is the English sonnet. The Italian sonnet is also known as the Petrarchan sonnet, named after a man, Francesco Petrarch. And the English sonnet is also known as the Shakespearean sonnet, named after the popular English poet and dramatist William Shakespeare. Now, both of these poems actually come to us in 14 lines, but there's a slight difference that I'd like to just explain as concerns both of them. Italian sonnet is unique because it comes to us in 2 divisions, the octave and the sestet. The octave is a poem of 8 lines, and the sestet is a poem of 6 lines. So you have 8 plus 6 comes down to 14. In addition to that, the rhyme scheme that you have in Italian sonnet is also very, very unique. the rhyme scheme in the Italian sonnet comes to us, that's for the octave, comes to us as A, B, B, A, B, B, A. So the octave, that is a poem of 8 lines, comes to us in the unique rhyme scheme of A, B, B, A, B, B, A. And the sextet comes to us in the rhyme scheme C, D, C, C, D, C, or C, D, E, C, D, E. So the octave and the sextet come together make up the Italian sonnet. Now for the English sonnet or the Shakespearean sonnet, it comes out to us in a little different form than the Italian sonnet. The Shakespearean sonnet comes to us in 3 quatrains and a couplet. A quatrain is a poem of 4 lines that also rhymes. So you have 3 quatrains as 3 quatrains as 4 lines plus 4 plus 4, that makes 12, and then the couplet is a poem of 2 lines. So 12 plus 2 comes down to 14. The rhyme scheme that you find in every Shakespearean sonnet comes out to us as A, B, A, B. So for the 3 quatrains, you have it as A, B, C, D, C, D, E, F, G, G. Okay? Now, let me just wrap up this video by simply talking about the fact that every poem can be described in terms of form and content. All the poems that I've just discussed, I describe them essentially based on their form or their content. A few of them actually combine both form and content together. For example, the epic. The epic is defined based on its length, that is the form, and the content, the fact that it tells a story about a human being and his vicissitudes against nature and against elemental forces. But some others like the haiku, the sonnet, okay, we describe those ones in terms of their form, their structure. Irrespective of the issues that are discussed, this is the form and the structure they come out to us. Then some others like the ode, okay, the ode and the ballad. The content actually is what defines these poems. So please, in your analysis of these poems, try as much as is possible to look at the poem from these 2 major points of view. Is it a poem that you can describe and approach from the form, or is it a poem that you can describe and approach from the perspective of the content? So here you have it, poetry in a nutshell. I do hope you have learned something. If you agree with me, or in the event that you disagree with me, please, I'd like to hear from you in the comment section below. Okay, drop your comments there, areas of agreements, areas of disagreements, and areas also that you have questions in, and I'll try my very best to respond to them as time goes on. So one more thing before I go, please, I'd like you to like my video, subscribe, and hit the notification bell. Thank you so very much for watching. I really appreciate your time, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye.